Imagine your life today without iPads, iPhones, MacBooks, and the basic design and affordability of a personal computer. Had it not been for the genius known as Stephen Paul Jobs, we would be living in an entirely different world. So, in light of his contributions, Steve Jobs deserves to be on the AP US History Wall of Fame. Steve Jobs was born on February 24th, 1955, in Green Bay, Wisconsin. His biological parents were Joanne Scheibel and Abdul Fattah Jandali. Before Steve was named, his parents put him up for adoption. He was adopted by Clara and Paul Jobs. Clara was an accountant, while Paul was a Coast Guard veteran and a mechanist. They lived in Mountain View, California, which would later be known as Silicon Valley. When Steve was a young boy, Paul would work on electronics with Steve in the family garage. Paul showed Steve how to take apart and reconstruct electronics. His hobby instilled Steve with confidence and proudness in mechanics. Steve was very intelligent at a very young age, and was bored throughout elementary school. He was known as a troublemaker and had to be bribed by his fourth grade teacher to study. He was kept in school by administrators despite his reputation for trouble because of his ability he displayed during testing. Steve's parents were offered to skip Steve into high school at the time because of his intelligence. His parents declined. When Steve eventually made it into high school at Homestead High School, he met his future partner, Steve Wozniak, who was attending University of California at Berkeley. After graduating from high school, Steve enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. He later dropped out after attending for only 6 months. In 1974, Jobs began to work as a video game designer for Atari, but left a few months later to find spiritual enlightenment in India. He traveled extensively and experimented with psychedelic drugs. In 1976, when Steve was 21, he and Wozniak started Apple Computer. They began in the Jobs family garage and funded their entrepreneurial venture by selling Steve's Volkswagen bus and Wozniak's scientific calculator. Apple thrived by democratizing technology, making it smaller, cheaper, and easier to use for everyday consumers. Steve was in charge of marketing Wozniak's user-friendly personal computers. The first model, the Apple I, rounded up a total of $774 million for the company. 3 years after the Apple II was released, Apple's sales increased by 700%, roughly $139 million. As Apple grew, Steve looked to John Sculley of Pepsi-Cola, a more experienced businessman, to take over the role of CEO of Apple. Unfortunately, after their relative success in sales, Apple had quite a few design flaws in many products, resulting in callbacks and customer disappointment. While Apple was experiencing this down point in their career, IBM, another tech company, surpassed Apple in sales. In an attempt to regain control over the IBM PC-dominated business world, Apple released Macintosh in 1984. Despite the positive sales and superior performance to IBM's PCs, Macintosh was not good enough for the public. Unfortunately for Steve, Sculley believed that Steve was hurting Apple, and because Steve did not have an official title with the company anymore, he was marginalized and eventually left. After leaving Apple, Steve founded another hardware and software enterprise in 1985 called Next Incorporated. In 1986, Steve purchased an animation company from George Lucas, which later became Pixar Animation Studios. Steve believed in Pixar's potential and invested $50 million in the company. Pixar, as you know, has made many great movies such as Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles. Later, in 2006, Pixar merged with Walt Disney Studios, making Steve Jobs Disney's largest shareholder. Despite Steve's success with Pixar, Next was struggling to sell its products. Eventually, in 1996, Apple bought the company for $429 million. Steve returned to his post as CEO for Apple. Thanks to Steve's brilliant campaigns, ingenious products, and stylish designs, Apple drew customers' attention again. A few years later, Steve learned that he had a neuroendocrine tumor, a rare but operable form of pancreatic cancer. Instead of immediately getting surgery, he postponed and chose to alter his already exotic pesco-vegetarian diet. This action made Apple's board of directors nervous about stockholders learning of their CEO's condition and withdrawing stocks. Steve acknowledged the board's concerns and had a successful surgery after 9 months of postponement. Apple has produced many influential and innovative products, such as the MacBook Air, iPod, and iPhone. Opposing companies have struggled to keep up with Apple's production. In 2007, Apple stocks were worth $200, a record-breaking number at the time, as well as $1.58 billion profit and an $18 billion surplus in the bank with zero debt. On October 5, 2011, Apple Incorporated announced that its co-founder had passed away. Steve Jobs was 56 years old. Stephen Paul Jobs was an amazing human being and was very influential in the technological world. Because of his role in the development of today's technology, Steve Jobs deserves a spot on the Northfield High School AP U.S. History Wall of Fame.